Coming up next, in-depth news analysis. You're listening to Korea24 from KBS World Radio.
The COVID-19 pandemic is wreaking havoc on the global economy, and that of course includes South Korea. Employment numbers have collapsed, exports have nosedived, and it's unclear when the local consumption will be revived again. President Moon Jae-in on Sunday addressed these concerns during a special address marking 3 years in office, revealing his economic policy direction for the remaining 2 years of his presidency. To discuss what he laid out and the key economic issues that Korea is facing with the pandemic in mind, we've invited two special guests on our show today. First, we have Professor Shin Sedon from Sungmyeong Women's University. He was also formerly the co-chairman of the main opposition United Future Party's election committee. Welcome back to the show, Professor.
Well, it's a great honor to be here.
And we also have with us Dr. 최지은, who used to be a senior economist for the World Bank and who is now the recently appointed international spokesperson for the ruling Democratic Party. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today, Dr. Che.
Thanks for having me.
So 3 years in office, another 2 to go for President Moon. He laid out a lot of ideas at that speech on Sunday with a particular focus on the economy post-COVID-19. But before we get into those details, I thought we could start with a brief evaluation of the Moon administration's economic performance over the past 3 years. Professor Shin, let me start with you.
Oh, me first? Okay. Well, the first thing that I want to emphasize is that Korean economy is losing luster. In other words, Korean economy is becoming more lackluster, in the sense that the rate of economic growth declined from 3.2% in 2017 to 2.7% in 2018, 2.0% 2019. In the first quarter, it showed 1.3%. So you will see that the growth rate of economy is kept decreasing over the last 3 years. That's one point. And another point is that the income of the person, income of the household is declining very rapidly, in the sense that the lower first and second quintile income actually has been decreasing over the last 3 years. I think that's that tells the entire story. The general economic growth rate has been coming down, and especially the lower income quintile persons are hit most.
Right, okay. So the Korean economy losing luster and low-income households, the income's declining there. Dr. Che, do you see it that way as well?
Well, yes. For the past years, the Moon administration focused on supporting income, creating jobs, and promoting innovation. During this time, as Professor Shin said, our GDP growth has been reduced from 3.2% in 2017 to 2% in 2019. However, these figures are actually higher than most of other OECD countries during the same period. And there are a lot of different factors, including unfavorable external environment such as US-China trade tensions. I think the Korean economy performed relatively well compared to other economies during the same time. And most recently, as you mentioned, the COVID-19 spreads, and the government uses various policy options to minimize the negative impact on the economy. But for the long-term perspective, I think the focus should be enhancing productivity and reducing inequality, which is something we should discuss further today.
Well, the point I think I should emphasize is that the ruling party members always compare the growth rate of Korea with another country, like advanced country. Advanced country generally has a lower economic growth.
Sure.
Okay, so it's pretty improper to compare Korean economic growth. You have to compare Korean economic growth to Vietnam or China. So that's ridiculous. Pointing out comparing Korean economic growth to advanced country is meaningless. I want to point out this one.
Wait, first, would you agree that's ridiculous? Because there is a point to be made that we may be more down the line than Vietnam, could we not? Is that an
Well, I
argument
think
you can make?
everything can be subjective. I guess like what are we going to compare? Are we going to compare Korea compared to other countries in the region, or are we going to compare Korea with other countries with the same income level? Depends on that. Our answer will be very.
Well, I want to point out this one. For example, last year, to 2019, the economic growth rate was 2.0%. Okay, that 2.0% is contributed by private sector, half a percentage, and 1.5, 3/4 of economic growth last year was contributed by the government. So, one point is Korean economic growth is decreasing over the last 3 years, and especially the private sector economic growth is declining very fast, and the government is kind of supplementing the fall in growth rate by huge government expenditure. That, I think, is the nature of the economic problem in Korea.
We should move on, but Dr. Che, let me just give you 30 seconds if you have a response to that.
Well, I think there are different factors we should discuss about economy, and especially the one like Korean economy, which is highly dependent on international trade and also external market. So we should also consider what happened in other countries, such as U.S.-China trade tensions. It is true that our the past 2% growth has been financed a lot to do with the government public investment and also public spending. However, during the economic recession or crisis situation, expansionary fiscal policy is necessary to boost the economy than anything else.
Right, we're at this point now as well where the past 3 years of Moon's presidency perhaps might be very different from the next 2 years because of what we have to deal with, this situation, the global COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's fair to say that that has pretty much changed everything. I think we saw that in President Moon's speech as well, where most of it was really focused on the outbreak and how the country is going to deal with it moving forward. The government's response seems to be two-pronged. One is, of course, the massive stimulus injections, and the other is the so-called Korean New Deal, which we'll get to in just a minute. Let's first hear what the president said during his speech on Sunday about where the economy stands and his plans to ride out the downturn.
문제는 경제입니다.
It is the economy that matters. This current economic crisis is being compared to the Great Depression 100 years ago. The world economy has ground to a halt. Factories have stopped producing, and the number of jobless people is rapidly increasing. As borders are closed and exchanges are blocked, global supply chains are disintegrating, and trade is declining sharply worldwide. Countries are facing the worst negative growth rates since the Great Depression. We are in a situation with no bottom and no end in sight. The government will concentrate all of its capabilities on overcoming the economic crisis. We will take the hands of those on the edge of a precipice. We will serve as a buttress safeguarding the lives and jobs of the people. As an unconventional and expedited emergency prescription, the government has injected 245 trillion won, more than 10% of the nation's GDP, into support for businesses and employment measures. The government is now preparing the third supplementary budget following the first and second.
So the president, they're emphasizing the scale of what is a global problem and the amount of money that the government is pumping back into the economy. Professor Shin, what was your take on this speech?
Well, so far there have been about 9 times kind of a government measure to fight against this coronavirus, and the total amount of those 9 government kind of measures total is about 240 trillion, which is about a little more than 10%. If you compare that to other countries like United States or Germany, okay, all those countries spend more than 20%. In the case of Germany, it's almost amounts to 30% of GDP. So relatively speaking, the kind of effort by Korean government is comparatively lower than other countries. That's one point. And another point is, if you look at the number specifically, 240 trillion, about 80% of that is financial resources. Having people to borrow and making arrangement by the government to facilitate the loan. But if you look at other countries, substantial portion of the measures are government fiscal measures. supplying funds, kind of a stipends, income, revenue. So that is the main difference. I think providing accessibility to financial resources is not enough for, of course it's helpful, but it's not going to be very helpful to the small, medium industries especially.
Dr. Chair, would you agree with that assessment?
Well, yes, we are experiencing one of the worst recessions in our lifetime. As we all know, IMF anticipated that the growth of the world economy will be negative 3% in 2020, which is the lowest since the Great Recession in 1930s. And Korea also going through a negative growth, which is unexpected, even the last year. So all industry production and domestic consumption fell, and as you described, employment is reduced sharply, mainly in services and also some in manufacturing. Particularly the young adults in their 20s and 30s suffered the most for the past month, according to the Ministry of Labor. So every country, including Korea, needs to use all policy instruments they can, including expansionary fiscal policies and monetary policies, as you mentioned, and to enhance their social safety net. So in terms of the amount the government is planning to finance as extra budget, I think it is necessary, it is required to avoid an even bigger recession and also to avoid the loss of government tax income in the future. Therefore, actually helps the fiscal sustainability in the long term.
Sure. I mean, this input is, I think we all agree that it needs to be put in because the economy is suffering. But Professor Shin is going on about the way that money is used. Is there, Professor Shin has concerns about that. What would you say about those concerns?
So let's say like two different things. First is the how much the money should be. And I think that what we describe about what the President Moon and also the Korean government plans is, I think, is reasonable, and we can even increase further in the future as debt to GDP ratio of South Korea is could rise to around 45%, even after considering the third extra budget is taken into account, which is much lower than most of other advanced economies, and which is also much lower than 60%, which is quite often noted as a potential prudential limit for the developed economies. For your point about where to spend this money, I think the one basic element of deciding where to spend is not only supporting the people who lost their job or who are most affected, but also supporting the sector that has more synergies and has more potential to boost the economy. So let's say looking at the fiscal multiplier for different sectors or fiscal multiplier of public spending.
Less than one.
We have to know the evidence. It's very difficult to
very
say.
Very low.
It's very difficult to build a causal relationship for the things what's happening right now. But I think the expansionary fiscal policy is recommended around the globe, including World Bank and IMF.
Yeah, the point I want to make is, about 240 trillion, more than 20% is guarantee. Guarantee, which is not money. Just government and financial institutions support the guarantee. Okay, that's not enough. So even the number is huge, to 240 trillion, which is more than 20%. The actual amount of money put into the people or business is a lot less than the 240 trillions. That's one point. And so I'm emphasizing that government has to put more fiscal, resources in helping small and medium-sized enterprise. That's the point.
I want to move on from this stimulus as well, because there's an important point of this Korean New Deal that I want to spend some time with as well. That was one of the grand economic plans that President Moon presented at this speech on Sunday. The question many people have been asking is, what is it exactly? Well, let's first hear how the president put it himself during his Q&A after his speech, marking his 3 years in office.
셋째, 일자리 창출을 위한 한국판 뉴딜을 국가 프로젝트로
Third, we will push ahead with a Korean version of the New Deal as a national project to create jobs. The government will present new opportunities for the people by creating new jobs. The Korean version of the New Deal is a preemptive investment for the future, designed to establish digital infrastructure. The early establishment of 5G infrastructure and the building of infrastructure to collect, accumulate, and use data will be pursued as national projects. Non-face-to-face industries related to medical services services, education, and retail distribution will be intensively fostered. The large-scale job creation project will be actively pursued.
도로와 교통망, 노후의 소시 등.
Okay, so that wasn't from the Q&A, but that was from the main body of his speech, explaining what the Korean New Deal was a little bit. He used the word infrastructure there, I think, several times. I think that's the key. Dr. Che, can you shed a bit more light on what this means exactly and what benefits the Korean New Deal could bring to the economy?
Sure. Going back to Professor Shin's point, the government fiscal policy should also focusing on firms and SMEs, and I think Korean New Deal might be the answer. So post-pandemic Korean New Deal could help creating new jobs in new sector and in innovative sectors. Thus, it can be new sources of Korean growth. This is different from the previous discussed expansionary fiscal policy, which tend to focusing on sustaining employment and supporting those who lost their jobs. So Korean New Deal is all about creating new jobs in new sectors. The initial suggestion for the Korean New Deal include investing in data infrastructure, such as AI and 5G technology, and also it includes developing non-face-to-face industries, such as online educations. But I think these efforts should be also accompanied by comprehensive measures to improve the business environment. And also, the government may consider expanding the industries that can be considered as a part of Korean New Deal, such as a Green New Deal or Korean biotechnology that we are discussing rapidly these days. And moreover, it considers setting up more inclusive safety nets and efforts for supporting the most vulnerables at a reasonable fiscal cost. So looking ahead, I think the COVID-19 outbreak has exposed not only challenges but also opportunities for Korean economy, and I think Korean New Deal is the pathway to go to take that opportunity.
So Professor Shin, Dr. Che there says the Korean New Deal might be the pathway or the answer for Korea's economic problems. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I agree most part of what she said, but so far up to today, nothing specific has been provided from the government or from the president. Okay, so we have to wait. What specific programs are included in that? Everything is all right. Digitalization and digital infrastructure and untapped industry development, everything is fine. Okay.
So you're saying the ideas are all correct?
The key I think elements are there twofold. First, how much government is willing to spend on that? The number that is coming from the government side is about the 30 trillion. 30 trillion, and I think 30 trillion may be enough for 1 year project. But if you really want the Korean kind of a New Deal, it's got to be at least 5 times of 30 trillion. That's one thing. And another point, I think, which is a very important point, is that initiative should be given not to the government, but to the private sector. So as long as government is trying to do everything, I think the probability is 90% failure, because we have experienced so many such failure in the past. So the amount of the resources to be put in New Deal, Korean New Deal, has to be at least 5 times. And the second, the private initiative, it has to be provided in order for that Korean New Deal be successful.
Dr. Chair, I think the money issue can be sorted out later. More money can be pumped into initiatives by the government. But what about this idea that it needs to be less hands-on from the government and be handed over more to the private sector? And also, does this really solve the issues that Korea is having right now? Because the digitization is great, but the people who are losing their jobs, who are in difficult positions right now, especially after COVID-19, that might not help them directly.
Yeah, so great point, both Professor Shin and then host. So I think the Korean New Deals, the amount, yes, it can be even expanded, but nobody actually decided how much it's gonna be or where the money will be spent. So as Professor Shin mentioned, this concept just came out, and we are in the process of designing the specific issues and then the details of the Korean New Deal. So your point about the importance of a private and public and private collaboration, absolutely yes. I also read that from a Korean New Deal suggestion that announced by the Korean government government and the president, there was several emphasis on public and private sector collaborations, and then a lot of things should be actually driven by a private sector. So I fully agree with your points. And in terms of supporting those people who lost their job, yes, that's absolutely true. So I think our discussion about Korean New Deal, or more broadly discussing about protecting the future of job driven by the digital technologies, should be accompanied by protecting and creating a social safety net, such as universal insurance, employment insurance that we are going to touch on later. So those social safety net should facilitate actually more flexible labor market, so which can also support new initiatives such as a Korean New Deal.
Well, we're basically out of time. Let me just squeeze in maybe 30 seconds each, your final thoughts about the Korean economy moving forward. Professor Shin.
Yeah, I think the government has to be more audacious about, this new kind of a challenging New Deal program, in the sense that government has to plan to put more resources into that. And in order to do that, I think the government has to get the agreement or support from the opposition party. Okay, so we have to have consensus. Okay, and only after consensus, I think the government is able to put more resources into the Korean New Deal. That's one thing. Second thing is education. We have so many unemployed youths, and the only way to get out of that is educating them with the first kind of hand information and structure. So,
Dr. Che, very briefly as well.
Yeah, I'm just surprised at how much Professor Shin is passionate about Korean New Deal, and then
I'm studying about that now.
suggesting to invest more money on Korean New Deal. So I agree with all of you that these are highly uncertain and challenging times for the global economy and for Korea. So the new normal could be very different from what we used to know after the COVID-19 outbreak. In my view, the structure of economy and the composition of labor market could be very different after the COVID-19 outbreak. And also the inequality could be further rising. So this circumstance make us to prepare for the future. Korean New Deal could create new jobs in innovative sectors, which could be the new source of growth for Korea. But at the same time, Korean New Deal should be accompanied by improved social safety net, such as universal employment insurance and enhanced business environment. So after all, for the long term, I think the most important thing is to enhance productivity of the Korean economy and in the long-term perspective.
We'll have to leave it there. We've been speaking to Professor Shin Sedon from Sookmyung Women's University and Dr. Jiun, international spokesperson for the Democratic Party. Thank you both for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you.